Bible, Daniel.
We're picking up in chapter 3, and where we left off, Daniel's three buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, if you want their Hebrew names, refused to worship this image that was set up by the king, and the king is pretty upset about it. And this is where we get the thing where there's some famous interchange here where the king says, you're gonna bow down. They said, we're not going to do that. It doesn't matter. And in verse 16 of chapter 3, they said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter about bowing down. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So the king was upset. I mean, and it's really cool what it says in here, and the way it's described it. Verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered. I like the way they said that. New American Standard. His facial expression was altered. Yeah, I mean, we've seen altered facial expressions when people are really intense about something, whether it's joy, anger, disdain, whatever. And so he commanded that these three guys be thrown into the furnace of fire, of course. And that's one of the most famous stories in all the Bible is thrown into the fiery furnace here. I'm going to see verse 24. It says, then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was astounded. He'd thrown them in there. When he threw them in, the people that threw them in got killed because the fire was so hot. But they went into the furnace. They were tied up when they were thrown in there. And then in verse 24 it says, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He responded and said to his high officials, was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, certainly, O king. He answered and said, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the fourth is like the son of the gods. Now the fourth one doesn't leave the furnace of fire. The 3 come out eventually, but the fourth one was seen in the midst of it, and he said, the fourth is like the son of the gods, or the son of God, gods, because they believed in plural gods at that time. And so what many would believe is that this was a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus, and that he was there in the midst of those, with those guys in the fire. And it says they came out, they weren't burned. They didn't even have the smell of smoke. The only thing that would burn from them apparently seemed to be the things they were tied up with, because they fell off and they were walking free. And so Nebuchadnezzar is impressed by this. Remember in the last chapter we ended with, Daniel was promoted. Nebuchadnezzar actually bowed down to him, paid homage. We'll get to the end of this chapter. We got another scenario here. Verse 29, therefore, Nebuchadnezzar, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here we got a political correct talk. But, I think it's kind of in a good way this time. It's if they speak anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, shall be torn limb from limb, and their house is reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. He was impressed. Nebuchadnezzar was impressed by what happened here. First they stood up to him. He was impressed with that, but in a bad way. And his facial expression changed. He was angry. He threw them in the fire. Then all of a sudden he found out the fire didn't even work. It killed some of his guys. Didn't kill these guys. There's a 4th guy in there helping him. Somebody's in there helping him in the furnace. And so he's so impressed that by the time at the end of it, he says, anyone that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is going to be torn limb from limb. Not a pretty sight. And because it says there's no other God who is able to deliver. Another declaration by Nebuchadnezzar. And this seems to be becoming an ongoing theme. We saw it in the last chapter. We see it at the end of this chapter. So then we go into chapter 4, and it's a personal dream. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and a vision. It says, verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. In these fantasies I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. And what he does is he has this dream, and he sees this great tree grow, and he sees it's prospering, and all of a sudden it's cut down and there's nothing left but the stump. And he sees all these things, and he's really troubled by it. And he calls in Daniel, because Daniel is known for interpretation. Daniel interprets the vision. We see in, I'll just read a little bit here in verse 19 of chapter 4. And Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, there it uses his Babylonian name, was appalled for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king responded and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar answered and said, my lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversaries. Because what Daniel saw here was that this dream was by Nebuchadnezzar, for Nebuchadnezzar, and it related to his life, and it was talking about he's going to be chopped down to nothing. He's going to live like an animal for 7 years. He's going to eat the grass of the field. He's going to be a mess. And so Daniel starts it out, if anyone ever gives you an interpretation of a dream and it starts with, oh, if only this applied to your adversaries and not to you. Not going to be a good sign. Now, that's not a good thing. So it happens. It says in verse 28, all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? It says, while the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you. So I guess, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built? I guess kind of the answer to that is kind of like no. God gave you an opportunity to participate in that, but you know what? He raises up, he brings down. And just as much as you think you raised all this up, you're coming down, and it's going to happen immediately. And so he's driven out, he lives like an animal, his fingernails grow long, and his hair grows all over his body, and he looks like this weird creature out there. All this stuff happens to him. He goes through 7 periods of time, apparently 7 years, and he finally comes back to his senses. And it says in verse 36 of chapter 4, I think it is there, at that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me. For the glory of my kingdom, and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now here we go again. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. So here he's making this great declaration about the Lord again, the God of, this time the God of Daniel, because he prophesied this thing, and he's saying he exalts and honors the King of heaven. Well, just before this, the whole reason he had to go through that is because he had to be humbled. And he said his works are true, his ways are just, he's able to humble those who walk in pride. And that's something you really don't want to test the Lord in, see if he's able to do that. It says in James, I believe, that he exalts the humble, and he brings down, he debases those that are proud. He'll exalt those that humble themselves, and he'll humble those who exalt themselves. And it's our job to humble ourselves, and if we do our job, he'll do his job, but if we do his job, he'll do our job. So if we exalt ourselves, he'll humble us. It's our job to humble ourselves. If we humble ourselves, he'll exalt us. And so Nebuchadnezzar learns this lesson, and he declares it, and he says the God of heaven is the one that we really want to serve. And so this is where we come to the end in the book of Daniel of this reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And so we're going to have a transition here as we move into chapter 5. And we move from Nebuchadnezzar's ruling to Nebuchadnezzar's son. And that doesn't go well, and we'll pick that up next time we go through our next session.